Welcome to our inaugural episode of PRESA Shop Talk. Today's subject, please don't call them modern attachments. Join us as we talk shop. Well, we're here to talk about not talking about modern attachments. What can we say about telling people to stop using this phrase, modern attachments, because what are we really talking about? Tara?
Yeah, modern attachments is the new term for a link in an email or a chat, any kind of communication where people are not appending an actual file, but are instead putting a link to another file. That is a very different thing than having an attachment, and it has very different implications for electronic discovery.
Yeah, I think it adds confusion too, because the word attachment, has historical use, especially in e-discovery. We know what that means. It's a tangible document that's attached to a parent. And I think it just adds confusion by using the word attachment, for example.
Well, and I can appreciate, though, why some people look at linked documents as, say, an analog to traditional attachments to emails, right? You've got, in a traditional situation, you have a message that's being sent out. You have an Excel file or other attachment, other document that's attached to the email. And so people have logically, at least in their minds, assumed that when you have a document that's linked from a cloud database into a message, that it's the e-discovery equivalent of an attachment like a PowerPoint or Excel, and therefore should be produced always in a family relationship if the attachment or the underlying message is relevant. And the fact is that that's not really the case, at least not from my perspective. It's not an apples to apples comparison.
It's really not, because it's important to understand that when we have an email and an attachment to the email, we're actually taking another file and we are locking it in place at a time and a place, and we are sending a package that is physical, that's stamped and time-stamped and locked is one thing at that moment in time. But when we're talking about hyperlinked records, we're talking about hyperlinked documents or references to websites, those things are changing, they're dynamic. What I send to you today in a hyperlink isn't going to be necessarily what you look at in 3 hours from now, never mind 3 weeks or 3 years.
Well, why is that? I think it's important to examine why that's the case.
Because right now we're getting into this world where we are keeping the original document, what we would consider an attachment, back at its source. And we're saying, here's a hyperlink so you can come and get this. We do this internally all the time. We send stuff, we drop it in Teams, and we communicate with each other because we want, hey, look at this document. So we don't need to make multiple copies. It's better information governance not to make multiple copies. But that doesn't serve us when it comes to e-discovery, and we need to see what somebody used and considered at that point in time. We can't trust that reference point back to where it was because we don't know. It's not being tracked that way.
No, and that's one of the problems with the current applications with Box, Dropbox, with Google Docs is they don't save versions by time. You have one document, one version. And so when you look at it, you're looking at what the most recent iteration of that was. You can't see what the person was considering at that time, and that's lost, especially since most of these have a time limit on how long they save the ability to go backwards on a document by document basis. Like 180 days is how long Box will save a version before it just deletes it, and you're just stuck with what's left.
I think that in addition to the authenticity of the evidence, if you will, or the use of this as being an actual attachment versus what was sent at a certain point in time, is the scope of discovery. We've always produced family complete. That means you get the whole email and you get all the attachments, regardless of whether the attachments are actually responsive or not, as long as the parent email is responsive, or if an attachment is relevant, you get the whole thing. And this is leading to some some dangerous places when it comes to links, because some people think, including some antitrust government enforcers, think that this means that anything that is contained in a relevant document that is linked should then go along for the ride of discovery. And that has all kinds of problematic implications at the point of collection, in how you process data, in how you review, and of course the production side. And that's not, I don't think it's realistic. We can do forensic examinations on individual documents when we know there's a reason, but we don't just go do that on every piece of evidence. And I think we have to look at links similarly. We don't need to drill down on every link and make sure we have the document that's on the other side of the link. If we have a reason to do so, we should, but we shouldn't go in with the assumption that every link needs to be treated this way.
I agree.
It's instructive that what you had said, Tara, and also what Greg had said. Greg had mentioned that the document is updated in the particular database. And that's essentially what the cloud application is that's housing this information. It's a database of information. And if we look at databases, they are dynamic, right? The information is constantly subject to modification or deletion. And so because it's dynamic data, you can send a traditional PowerPoint or Excel document and it is a snapshot in time. It stays as an attachment as long as you have the email and you keep that particular email. But if I send an Excel document to this group and do it as a hyperlinked document from M365 or another repository, and as soon as that document is edited or revised or whatever you want to call it that it's done to it, then that document is no longer the snapshot in time of what I sent at a given moment. And this is something I had to deal with as a special master in a particular case from a couple of years ago, where there were certain relevant documents that needed to be examined in litigation. But were these documents actually what they were purported to be? And looking at these documents, they were linked Google Drive documents. We went in and examined the fact that many of the documents, even though there was a link there, didn't exist anymore. The links, it's not that they were broken, that permissions for the particular user had been revoked, or the document itself had been deleted and it didn't exist anymore. And so they couldn't be recalled and produced. You don't have that trouble in a traditional situation with an attachment and email. So that's one of my biggest problems with people signing on to the idea that this is a so-called modern attachment. A hyperlinked document placed into an email is linked content. It's not a modern attachment or anything like an attachment.
Hear, hear.
And that can cause, not understanding that can cause people to go to some really strange places. We've been asked on a matter to actually recreate documents that were collected from they're in their active version, and then go through the production and append them as actual attachments anywhere we determined they were linked. Greg found a much better way through that, but that would have created all kinds of problems with having real evidence and sort of a guess of what evidence might have looked like in the same document as attachments.
Well, and if you're going in and trying to marry up every single linked document with every single message, and we're not just talking about email, we're talking about in Slack, messages sent in Slack. If you're talking about M365, messages sent in Teams. If you're talking about email, it could be messages from a Google Drive document, from Dropbox, Box, and so forth. So we have all these different things. And my point on this is that it's not necessarily proportional to do so, and courts have agreed with that assessment.
I think it's really important, the proportionality concern on when are you doing this and how much effort are you going to put into this? Nichols versus Noom, we could put the citation below, is very instructive into considering the proportionality of this.
And I think there are cases and probably new technologies available where there may be something reasonable to do. Greg, in your project, you found a way through that I think was, not necessarily something we would have done in a civil litigation, but it wasn't completely out of bounds on meeting something that I think was, it wasn't a big expenditure, what the value was and whether the requesting side was entitled to it is different. But, Greg, I
Yeah.
think that you navigated that well.
So we were in front of an agency with a second request. And as a part of that second request, the agency became aware that there were Google Docs. There were links embedded into the emails, and they requested us to do a production and to do that overlay to try to create a parent-child relationship. And instead, what we proposed and what ultimately was accepted was something much more sophisticated, I think. We did some scripting on the back end. We were able to isolate these links on each of the documents they were associated with. We were able to determine the times and the metadatas from the documents on the Google Drive and tie that into an email chain, say that had 3 or 4 emails, and we could find the most recent, the most close in time email and create a hyperlink metadata within that record so that the agency had access to whatever that particular document was just by clicking on the hyperlink. So on an individual basis, there was not a document that existed in a parent-child relationship. What there was the existing family, and then on the parent, there was a hyperlink that the agency could then use to go and access that document if they wanted to. It ended up being something that instead of going down the Noom path and spending what I think was $180K, we could do in about a week. And we were able to turn that around, provide the overlay to the agency, and they were satisfied with that.
Well, Greg, that was what one side had said. It would cost $180,000,
Yeah.
Nichols versus Noom. The other side had said, you can do this on Dixie cup and string, and it would cost you $5,000. And
You're not suggesting they were exaggerating, are you?
All I'm suggesting, because I wouldn't impugn anybody's credibility as an officer of the court and their fellow officers of the court, all I'm suggesting is that the court may have thought that the truth was somewhere in between and ultimately punted on the issue because the court found that it was simply not proportional to the needs of the case. So the point that you're making, Greg, which is a good one, is that the work can be done and it can be done for X number of dollars, and it's important to triage the cost before going forward, whether it's $180,000, $5,000, or somewhere in between.
I'd like to end this with this important thought. What are you doing this for? What are you pulling these things for? Is it for evidence? If it's for evidence of what somebody saw and what was transferred to somebody at a point in time to see what they saw and why they took the action, these are hyperlinks. I can't tell you what they saw at that point in time if I'm using a hyperlink versus an attachment. And I think that's where this really lies in. These are not attachments. So can we please stop calling these modern attachments? I think that'll wrap it up for this session.
Yeah.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
Thank you.